Deep in a remote corner of Africa, there's a small community where something impossible seems to happen generation after generation. Babies are born with bright blue eyes. Not gray, not hazel, not a trick of the light. Pure, striking blue, the kind of blue you expect to see in Scandinavia or Northern Europe, not in the heart of the African continent. For decades, outsiders who stumbled across this tribe assumed they were looking at the result of colonial mixing, missionaries, traders, or foreign soldiers passing through generations ago. But when scientists finally sat down and studied the genetics, they found something that made no sense at all. There was no European ancestry, no hidden bloodline from across the sea, no simple explanation waiting to be uncovered, just a mystery that refused to close. If you enjoy stories where science runs into something it cannot fully explain, stay with me, because this one gets stranger the deeper you go. Stories like this tend to attract attention quickly online, and this one is no different. Photographs of tribe members with startling blue eyes against dark skin have circulated on social media for years, often stripped of any real context, sometimes accompanied by wild claims about ancient aliens, lost European bloodlines, or secret royal ancestry. Most of those claims collapse the moment anyone applies basic scrutiny. But underneath the noise and the clickbait headlines, there is a real, documented, and genuinely puzzling biological question that legitimate researchers have spent years trying to untangle. Separating the actual science from the internet mythology is not easy, but it is worth doing. Because the real answer, even without aliens or secret bloodlines, is strange enough on its own. To understand why this discovery shook researchers so badly, you first need to understand how blue eyes are supposed to work. Eye color comes from a pigment called melanin, the same pigment responsible for skin tone and hair color. Brown eyes contain a lot of melanin in the iris. Blue eyes contain very little. For most of human history, every single human being on Earth had brown eyes. Blue eyes did not exist anywhere. Then, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, a single genetic mutation appeared near the Black Sea in a population of early European farmers. That mutation affected a gene called OCA2, which controls how much melanin gets produced in the iris. The mutation did not destroy the gene, it simply turned its volume down like a dimmer switch on a light. Instead of full brown pigment, the iris produced almost none, and light scattered through the thin blue-gray tissue in a way that made the eyes appear blue. Here is the part that geneticists find remarkable. Every person on Earth today with blue eyes, whether they live in Norway, Ireland, Canada, or Australia, can trace that trait back to this one single ancestor. It is not several separate mutations that happen to produce the same result. It is one mutation, one person, one moment in genetic history, passed down for thousands of years through countless generations. Scientists call this a founder mutation, because everyone who carries it today is, in a very real sense, distantly related through that one ancestral line. So when researchers heard rumors of an African tribe where blue eyes appeared naturally, without any documented European contact, the first assumption was simple. Somewhere along the family tree, a European ancestor must have introduced the same OCA2 mutation, and it had simply been passed down quietly for generations. This would have been the easy answer, the boring answer, the answer that fit neatly into everything we already understood. But the DNA told a different story. When geneticists finally sequenced samples from tribe members with blue eyes, they searched specifically for the well-known European mutation. It was not there. The exact genetic switch responsible for blue eyes in Europe, the one every blue-eyed person outside Africa shares, simply did not exist in these individuals. Whatever was causing their eyes to appear blue was happening through a completely different genetic pathway, one that had never been documented in a stable, healthy population before. This finding forced researchers to look elsewhere in the genome, and what they found opened up new questions instead of answering the old ones. Before we go further, it helps to understand just how tightly controlled eye color usually is, and how rarely nature deviates from the expected script. Across almost the entire African continent and across most of human history everywhere on Earth, dark brown eyes are close to universal. This is not an accident of culture or preference. It is the direct result of high melanin production being extremely useful in regions with intense sun exposure near the equator. Melanin does more than darken skin and hair. It also protects the eyes from ultraviolet damage, and in populations that evolved under strong, direct sunlight for hundreds of thousands of years, natural selection strongly favored high melanin levels across the board, including in the iris. This is exactly why naturally occurring blue eyes are so rare in equatorial Africa. It is not that the mutation could never happen there. It is that, under normal circumstances, evolution would have quietly worked against it, favoring darker eyes generation after generation. For a lighter-eyed trait to persist and spread within a population living under strong equatorial sun, something unusual has to be happening. whether that is genetic isolation, chance, or some hidden benefit, large enough to counteract the usual selective pressure. One possibility researchers considered early on was a condition called Waardenburg syndrome. This is a rare genetic condition that can cause strikingly pale or blue eyes, along with other distinctive features, such as patches of unusually light skin or hair, and in some cases, hearing loss. Waardenburg syndrome has been documented in populations across the world, including parts of Africa, and it is caused by mutations in genes that control how pigment-producing cells move and develop in the body during early growth in the womb. Unlike the OCA2 mutation responsible for European blue eyes, which only affects the iris, Waardenburg syndrome affects pigment cells throughout the body, meaning it can sometimes come bundled with other visible traits. At first glance, this seemed like a promising lead. Except when doctors examined the tribe members carefully, most of them showed none of the other signs typically associated with Waardenburg syndrome. No hearing loss S, no patches of depigmented skin, no unusual hair coloring, just healthy individuals living completely normal lives with eyes that happened to be blue. If it was Waardenburg syndrome, it was behaving in a way researchers had never seen it behave before, isolated almost entirely to eye color and nothing else. Some geneticists who reviewed early samples also raised the possibility of a related but distinct condition known as ocular albinism, where pigment production is reduced specifically within the eye, while skin and hair remain largely typical. Unlike full albinism, which affects pigment across the entire body and often comes with significant vision problems and extreme sun sensitivity, ocular albinism can sometimes be far more limited in its effects, occasionally producing lighter eye color with only mild changes to vision. When tribe members with blue eyes were examined for the vision problems commonly associated with albinism-related conditions, some mild sensitivity to bright light was reported anecdotally, but nothing severe enough to match a classic albinism diagnosis. This left researchers in an awkward middle ground with a trait that showed a few overlapping features with several known conditions, but did not cleanly match the full diagnostic picture of any single one of them. Other researchers proposed a different theory, one rooted not in disease, but in evolutionary pressure. Every trait that spreads through a population usually spreads because it offers some kind of advantage or because it is genetically linked to something that offers an advantage. Scientists began to wonder whether this mutation, whatever it was, might be connected to something beneficial happening beneath the surface. Perhaps it improved resistance to a local disease. Perhaps it was tied to some other trait entirely unrelated to eye color, and the blue eyes were simply a visible side effect riding along with the real advantage, invisible to the naked eye. This is not as strange as it sounds. Biology is full of examples where one gene influences several traits at once, a phenomenon called pleiotropy. A single genetic change can alter your eye color and, at the same time, quietly affect something happening in your immune system or your nervous system, with no obvious connection between the two on the surface. If that is what is happening in this tribe, the blue eyes might just be the mostrao, a T-visible clue of a much larger genetic story still waiting to be uncovered. There is also a theory involving something scientists call genetic drift, especially relevant in small, isolated populations. When a community is small and somewhat cut off from outside groups, rare mutations that appear in just one or two individuals can spread through the population much faster than they would in a large, widely mixed society. Imagine a village of only a few hundred people. If one person is born with a rare mutation causing blue eyes, and that person has children, and their children have children, within a few generations, a meaningful percentage of the entire village could carry that same trait, purely by chance, with no natural selection required at all. Small populations are like small ponds. A single drop of ink can color the whole pond far faster than it could color an ocean. This theory is compelling because it does not require any special advantage or hidden disease. It only requires isolation, time, and chance. And this particular tribe has lived in relative isolation for a very long time, maintaining strong cultural and genetic boundaries with neighboring groups for generations. Marriage largely occurs within the community. Outside contact, historically, has been limited. These are exactly the conditions under which a rare spontaneous mutation could take hold and spread within a closed population, becoming almost a defining feature of that specific group over time, even though the same mutation would likely never spread the same way in a larger, more mixed population. It is worth pausing here to look at how this compares to other unexplained pigment mysteries scattered across the world, because this tribe is far from the only example of biology defying expectations. In parts of Melanesia, particularly among certain populations on the Solomon Islands, researchers documented dark-skinned communities with naturally occurring blonde hair, a combination that seems just as contradictory on paper as dark-skinned Africans with blue eyes. For years, outsiders assumed this blonde hair must have come from European sailors or traders visiting the islands centuries ago. When geneticists finally studied the population directly, they discovered the trait was caused by a completely different gene than the one responsible for blonde hair in Europeans, a gene called TYRP1, mutated independently within the Melanesian population itself, with no European ancestry involved at all. It was, in effect, a second unrelated invention of blonde hair, arising separately on the far side of the planet. That discovery is often cited by geneticists studying the African blue eyes case as a reminder that pigmentation traits are not as fixed or as geographically exclusive as people assume, and that independent, parallel mutations producing similar visible results are more common in human history than most people realize. Still, researchers were not satisfied with theories alone. They wanted to know exactly where in the genome this mutation was hiding and what it was actually doing at a molecular level. This meant comparing the full genetic sequences of tribe members with blue eyes against members of the same tribe with typical brown eyes, searching for any consistent difference between the two groups. This kind of analysis is painstaking work. The human genome contains more than 3 billion genetic letters, and finding the handful that matter among that ocean of information is like searching for a specific grain of sand on a very long beach. What the researchers eventually found was a set of unusual variations near genes involved in pigment regulation, but not the same variations found in European populations, and not a clean match for any previously cataloged form of Waardenburg syndrome. Either, it appeared to be something new, or at least something rare enough that it had never been closely studied in a living, functioning community before. Some scientists have cautiously suggested that this could represent an independent origin of blue eyes entirely separate from the European mutation, evolving on its own timeline, through its own genetic pathway, completely disconnected from the ancestor near the Black Sea that gave rise to blue eyes everywhere else in the world. If that turns out to be true, it would mean blue eyes have appeared not once in human history, but at least twice, independently, on 2 different continents, through 2 entirely different genetic mechanisms, arriving at a strikingly similar visible outcome. This is not unheard of in biology. Remember that nature often finds more than one path to the same destination. Different populations facing different pressures can stumble onto similar physical traits without sharing the same underlying cause. Scientists call this convergent evolution, and it shows up again and again throughout the natural world, from wings evolving separately in birds, bats, and insects, to dark skin evolving independently in populations exposed to intense sunlight on completely different continents. But there is another layer to this story that goes beyond pure genetics, and it has to do with how the tribe itself understands and explains the trait. Within the community, blue eyes are not viewed as a medical anomaly or a scientific puzzle. They are woven into local belief and oral tradition, passed down through storytelling rather than laboratory data. Some elders describe the trait as a mark tied to specific ancestral lineages within the tribe, a kind of inherited identity that distinguishes certain family lines from others. Children born with blue eyes are sometimes seen as carrying a connection to those specific ancestors, a living reminder of where their family branch originated within the wider tribal structure. This cultural framework existed long before any outside researcher arrived with sequencing equipment, and it offers an interesting parallel to the scientific explanation. Long before anyone understood DNA, the community had already noticed that this trait ran in families, clustering along specific bloodlines, passed from parent to child in a pattern that looked an awful lot like genetic inheritance, described in the language of ancestry and lineage instead of genes and mutations. This raises an important point that often gets lost in stories like this one. Indigenous communities frequently observe and understand patterns of inheritance long before modern science arrives to explain the mechanism behind them. Traditional knowledge is not the same as scientific proof, but it is also not simply superstition to be dismissed. In this case, the community's own understanding of which family lines carry the trait lines up remarkably well with what the genetic data eventually revealed, hinting that the mutation likely originated from one or a small handful of ancestors within the tribe itself, then spread outward through specific family branches over the generations. Exactly the kind of pattern you would expect from a founder mutation taking hold inside a genetically isolated group. Researchers are now faced with several possibilities, and honestly, they may not be mutually exclusive. It is possible that a spontaneous new mutation arose within the tribe at some point in the past, unconnected to any outside population, and then spread through the community due to the small size and relative isolation of the group. It is possible that this mutation is a previously undocumented variant related to pigmentation genes already known to science, behaving in an unusual and unusually limited way compared to how those genes typically behave elsewhere. It is even possible, though currently unproven, that the trait carries some subtle biological advantage, specific to the tribe's environment, something scientists have not yet identified because they have not had the opportunity to study it deeply enough. What makes this case particularly frustrating and fascinating for researchers is how little formal, in-depth genetic study has actually been conducted so far. Much of what is currently known comes from limited sample sizes, informal observations, and preliminary sequencing rather than the kind of large-scale, long-term genomic study that solves so many other mysteries about human diversity. Conducting deeper research requires trust, consent, and collaboration with the community itself, something that takes time to build properly and respectfully, especially given the long, difficult history of outside researchers extracting genetic material from indigenous groups without proper consent or benefit sharing, a history that has left understandable caution and skepticism in many communities around the world. This means the full answer to why this tribe carries blue eyes may still be years away, sitting somewhere in an unanalyzed data set or a study still waiting to be properly funded and conducted with the full cooperation and consent of the people involved. Science does not always move quickly, especially when it involves small, remote, historically marginalized populations who have every reason to be cautious about outsiders showing up with test tubes and clipboards. That caution is not paranoia. It is rooted in a long, well-documented history of researchers extracting blood and tissue samples from indigenous and tribal communities around the world, publishing papers, building careers and databases from that genetic material, and giving little or nothing back to the communities who provided it in the first place. Some of the most well-known genetic diversity projects of the last several decades faced exactly this criticism, accused of treating indigenous DNA as a scientific resource to be mined, rather than treating the people who carried it as partners in the research. Modern researchers working with this tribe are, at least officially, trying to do things differently, involving community, leaders, and decisions about what gets studied, how samples are used, and whether findings get published at all. Whether that approach is followed consistently in practice is something outside observers cannot always verify, but it does shape how quickly and how carefully any deeper study of this mutation is likely to move forward. There's also a practical financial reality behind the slow pace of research, large scales. Genomic studies are expensive, and funding tends to flow toward research with the most obvious commercial or medical applications. A rare pigmentation trait in a small, remote tribe, however fascinating, does not carry the same funding appeal as research into cancer genetics or widespread hereditary diseases. Some researchers who have expressed interest in studying this population further have openly admitted that securing long-term funding for a project like this is difficult, competing against thousands of other proposals for a limited pool of grant money. This is one of the quieter reasons why so many fascinating genetic mysteries around the world remain only partially studied for years or even decades, not because scientists lack curiosity, but because curiosity alone does not pay for sequencing equipment, laboratory time, or the years of fieldwork required to do this kind of research properly and respectfully. In the meantime, this mystery serves as a powerful reminder of just how much we still do not know about human genetic diversity, even after decades of mapping the human genome and comparing DNA from populations across the globe. We tend to assume that because science has explained so much, it must have explained almost everything. But the human genome is staggeringly complex, filled with rare variants, unusual mutations, and isolated populations that have never been fully studied. Every so often, a case like this one appears, quietly defying the tidy explanations we thought we already had, forcing scientists to admit that there is still more to learn. It also challenges an assumption many people carry without even realizing it, the assumption that certain physical traits belong exclusively to certain parts of the world. Blue eyes are often treated, culturally and sometimes even scientifically, as an inherently European trait, something that only makes sense in the context of Scandinavian ancestry or northern climates. But biology does not actually work according to cultural assumptions. Genes do not know about continents or the categories humans have invented to sort each other. Mutations can and do arise anywhere, in any population, given enough time and the right circumstances. The existence of naturally occurring blue eyes in an African community, arising through a completely separate genetic pathway from the European mutation, is a striking illustration of that fact, a visible reminder that human traits do not respect the boundaries we like to draw on maps. This case also fits into a much larger pattern that keeps showing up whenever scientists study human genetic diversity closely. Time and again, researchers have discovered that traits assumed to be tied to a single region or a single ancestry turn out to have multiple independent origins scattered across the globe. Lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, evolved separately in European populations who raised dairy cattle, and in certain East African pastoralist groups who did the same, through entirely different genetic mutations that happened to produce the same practical result. High-altitude adaptations evolved independently among Tibetan populations in the Himalayas and Andean populations in South America, again through separate genetic pathways arriving a asimilar biological solution. Dark, protective skin pigmentation evolved independently among populations in South Asia and Aboriginal Australians, despite those groups having no recent shared ancestry connecting them. Each of these cases tells the same underlying story. When different human populations face similar environmental pressures, or when a small isolated group experiences a rare spontaneous mutation, evolution does not require a single shared origin point to arrive at a similar visible outcome. Biology is resourceful. Given enough time, enough isolation, and enough genetic variation to work with, it tends to find more than one road leading to the same destination. Seen through that lens, a small African tribe with naturally blue eyes stops looking like an impossible anomaly and starts looking like one more example of a pattern that keeps repeating throughout human genetic history. A pattern of independent invention, parallel mutation, and quiet biological creativity happening in isolated pockets all over the world, largely undocumented until a curious scientist happens to notice and start asking questions. There is something almost humbling about a discovery like this. For all our advanced sequencing technology, our massive genetic databases, and our detailed maps of human ancestry, nature still finds ways to surprise us. A small community living according to its own traditions in a specific corner of Africa carries a trait that current science cannot fully explain. A trait that may represent an entirely independent chapter in the story of human genetic variation, one that started somewhere completely separate from the well-known European mutation everyone assumed was the only path to blue eyes. Perhaps in a few years, with proper research, consent, and collaboration, scientists will finally identify the exact mutation responsible, trace it back through the generations, and understand precisely why it arose and how it spread. Or perhaps this will remain one of those quiet mysteries at the edge of human genetics, acknowledged, documented, but never fully resolved, a reminder that even now, in an age where we can sequence an entire genome in a matter of hours, the human story still holds a few secrets it has not yet been ready to give up. Until that day comes, the tribe continues living much as it always has, with its own understanding of who its blue-eyed member, are, and where that trait comes from, passed down not through scientific papers, but through the voices of elders telling stories to the next generation. And somewhere in that overlap between ancient oral tradition and modern genetic science, between what a community has always known and what researchers are only now beginning to confirm, lies one of the more remarkable open questions in human biology today. What do you think is really behind it? A hidden mutation science has not caught up to yet, an ancient link buried somewhere deep in the historical record, or something we have not even considered? Let me know your thoughts, and if this kind of story fascinates you as much as it fascinates me, stick around. Because human genetics is full of mysteries, just like this one, still waiting to be uncovered.